This is the BBC.
Dear brothers and sisters, all are welcome here at the Confessions podcast, whether saint or sinner.
Hey, hello and welcome. It's another Confessions podcast from your friends at the BBC. Yes, the Radio 2 branch. Let's see what we can manage in this particular recording with Sister Bobby and young Joe, all here and all very keen to get on with this podcast. Greetings to everybody.
I love it when you say that.
What?
Young Joe.
Well, you know, everyone's young to me, pretty much.
Yeah, it costs me so much, though, every single time. Anyway, this week our Confessions haul includes Mark's story, Boom, Shake the Tomb. Martin has a lack of child protection in a cinema projection. In his tale, really slaying something. And there's Anakin's moment of darkness with a pretend lightsaber, which we've called Saving the Best to Mass. You kind of get the idea. And, of course, we'll be raiding the vaults for another confession from the crypt requested by you.
But let's start this week with Nick's story of Help the Aged Gone Wrong, Shopper Don't Preach.
Please be seated.
Dear Father Simon and the Archbishops of Arbitration, I think that was new. My confession dates back 6 or 7 years, takes place on a typically cold and drizzly day in the northeast of England. I like to think of myself as a fairly public-spirited sort of person. Nothing which could particularly be described as heroic, you understand, but I'm not averse to performing a good deed when the opportunity arises. Such occasion presented itself to me on my weekly shop at the out-of-town supermarket. My public-spiritedness extended to not hogging the parking bays close to the entrance, reserved for the infirm or those with extra family baggage, and as I made my way across the vast distance from the outer perimeter to the trolleys, I noticed an elderly gent attempting to disembark from his vehicle, which was parked up in a priority space just a few yards from the door. Although he'd made a grand job of positioning his vehicle, getting out of it obviously was posing a problem for him. Still some distance away, I watched as he manoeuvred awkwardly and painfully, one leg in and one leg out of the driver's seat. He was still struggling as I drew level. Full of the milk of human kindness, I bounded up to the old fella and said to him cheerfully, "Here we go, pal, let me help you." And with that I supported his arm and heaved. Although diminutive and frail, he was heavier than he looked. Nevertheless, after a brief struggle, he was standing by the side of his car, and my good deed was complete. The very senior citizen gave me a look of surprise and confusion, which I interpreted as a sign that his experience of the youth of today had not always been so positive. But not requiring any gratitude, I gave him a friendly, "Have a good day," and on something approaching Cloud 9, virtually skipped into the supermarket, buoyed by that feeling that I'd done a very good deed. Grabbing a basket, I commenced shopping and continued feeling pretty good about myself, humming around the home baking, flashing smiles to the fishmongers. You get the picture. Nick is overwriting here just a little bit. Completing my supermarket sweep, continuing, in a time which would have been very high up on the leaderboard, I glanced out of the plate glass windows into the car park whilst waiting my turn at the checkout, which gave me a direct eye line to the old boy I had assisted merely minutes before. And it was then I realised my error. To my surprise, the elderly gentleman was still at his car, with the door open, still looking rather frail, and being fussed over by 3 people. I was suddenly filled with dismay when it dawned on me that the 3 people around him were not assisting him towards the supermarket. Instead, they were carefully lowering him into his car. You see, Father Simon, by the time I had arrived on the scene several minutes earlier, the man had actually completed his shopping and in fact just made it back into his car. It had taken him ages to get in. My intervention had hoisted him straight back out again, and yet his day was put out by some considerable time and inconvenience, necessitating the intervention of 3 additional people to complete the job. I queued at the conveyor belt in a bright red fog of embarrassment, the laughing cow cheeses seeming to find my mortification especially hilarious. Here we go. After studying the supermarket's free magazine for what must have seemed a peculiarly long time, I figured that it was safe to re-emerge into the car park. Fortunately for all concerned, the old man had finally been able to drive away, safe from the clutches of misguided do-gooders and busybodies like me, says Nick. In summary, I must ask forgiveness on behalf of the elderly gentleman who I probably frightened considerably and definitely inconvenienced significantly. I only hope that my good deed didn't leave him with a negative view of all youngsters. I've definitely learned a valuable lesson about thrusting assistance upon people without finding out whether they actually need it in the first place. Thank you for hearing my confession. I hope it meets with clemency, which I suspect it probably will. But he, a couple of questions would have been fine. Like, do you want to get out? And he'd said, no, I just got in. Would have been fine. But anyway, you can't query his motives. But anyway, young Joe.
For some reason, I'm thinking of The Good Life. It's something from like a 70s sitcom, this.
Terry and June.
Yeah, Terry and June, maybe that's the one. Of course you have to forgive. This is someone who is a self-confessed busybody and do-gooder, and he was only trying to help this guy. Obviously, he should have asked the question, but he was just kind of taken away with the spirit of trying to help people. I think I do this. Because I'm always on the train. I'm always trying to help people, and they do quite often just go, no. And just make you feel really stupid.
What a good person you are.
I just like helping people. So I feel like Nick is a kindred spirit, so I'm going to forgive him for that reason.
I just have this vision of someone taking like 10 minutes to get into the car, and then chirpy young Nick walking past, hoiking him out again, and saying, oh, here we go, I've got to spend ages getting back.
He should have shouted. The old man should have shouted and said, leave me alone. So I think maybe he's the one that's at fault.
Yeah, blame it on him. Blame it on the old guy. Joe's mask slipping there. Hey, old timer, it's your fault. Bobby.
Well, there's always a place for a do-gooder and a busybody. No crime drama was ever really fixed, was it, without somebody saying, well, I saw this. So I say generally, do-gooders and busybodies I'm absolutely fine with. But, Nick, I don't think I can forgive you because you should have asked. And, you should have just gestured or something, even if he couldn't hear you. There must have been some way of checking that he wanted to be removed from his vehicle. Also, the man might have been quite scared. He might have just been frightened and thought he was being abducted or something. So maybe that's why the old man stayed quiet.
Up.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did look slightly surprised and
I don't
nonplussed.
forgive Joe for being so harsh. So, Nick, you're not forgiven.
So Nick's not forgiven. The old guy's not forgiven.
I know it's Joe.
No.
It's the people's verdict. Who do you forgive, if anyone, on the text 88291?
The Confessions Podcast.
My confession spans about 20 years. And it really does span 20 years. Starts back in 1980, where on a cold February Saturday evening, I just said goodnight to my girlfriend at her parents' house. It's about 11 p.m. Just as I started my walk home, I heard the footsteps of someone walking down the road. This was a dark road I was on, and my first thought was that this was a girl returning from a night out in the local town who couldn't afford the taxi ride home. Now, as a 19-year-old 6'2" rugby player, I thought my sudden appearance out of a darkened side road and then walking behind the girl down the road may cause distress. So I thought it'd be better, being thoughtful about it, to retreat into the bushes, let the lady pass, and then follow at a safer, longer distance. I stepped back into the shadows and waited.
In theory.
Yeah. Imagine my surprise when a man dressed in all black, wearing a top hat, cloak, and a cane stepped into the streetlight. It seemed it wasn't a lady after all, but a vampire. The vampire then reached down and opened the gate to the church before walking into the church grounds and disappearing from sight. I stood there wondering what a vampire was doing in the churchyard. Exactly what was he after anyway? Was there a secret vampire society in the village? Before I knew what I was doing, I found myself walking towards the church, whilst also thinking that this was a very, very bad idea indeed. When I reached the front door of the church, it was firmly closed, as were all the other doors I tried. You were really going to go into a darkened church? This clearly didn't make any sense, but then again, nothing made sense. Vampires don't exist, and even if they did exist, what were they doing at church? I decided I would do one more lap of the church, and if I didn't see the vampire, I'd just go home. Very sensible. I just reached the far side of the church when I heard the creaking of an old iron gate opening, or closing, from down through the graveyard. I made my way through the headstones and towards the lower corner where the tombs were located. And as I approached, I saw the vampire open the gate to one of them and descend the steps. Again, vampires don't exist, but what was going on here? I crept to the front of the tomb and decided on a course of action. I would count out loud to 3, run past the entrance, look in, and then continue through the graveyard, over the fence, through the back gardens, that backed onto the church, and run home. Steadied myself, took a few deep breaths, and then counted 1, 2, 3. As I moved and looked, the vampire was coming up the stairs. There was a blood-curdling scream, and I was gone. I have never moved so fast in my life. Spring forward, this is an unusual tale. Spring forward 14 years, and I've moved into my own house and no longer live in the village. I remain in contact with my old friends, and we'd meet up at times, but I never shared with them what occurred on that night. Then my friends Simon and Ruth got married, had a daughter, and they were going to get christened at the church, the aforementioned church, and I was invited. It was a lovely spring day, and the christening went well. And as the family were in the grounds having photos taken, I found myself at the back of the church looking down towards the corner where my close encounter occurred. "It's Mark, isn't it?" I heard a voice next to me say. "Haven't seen you for a few years." "It's our local vicar, the Reverend Underhill." I'm sorry, I've got into a stereotypical vicar's voice. "The Reverend Underhill." "No," I replied, and continued to explain I had finished college and now live some 40 miles north of here. "I can tell you a strange story about the graveyard if you like," said the vicar. I assume he took my silence to be confirmation, and he said, "I'm an insomniac, you know, and have been at the parish for almost 40 years. I have a passion for genealogy." I looked blank. He continued, "The study of family history, family trees, you know. Anyway, I remember about 10 years ago, I'd just been to a fancy dress party. And I came home and decided I wasn't going to get any sleep. So I decided to come to the church from the vicarage and continue my family tree research. I'd just finished in a particular tomb just there. And as I was climbing the steps to leave, someone jumped out at me and shouted, 3. And then before I knew what was happening, they were gone." The Reverend continued, "I screamed in fright. I fell backwards down the steps. I broke my ankle. And when my wife woke at 5 in the morning, she realised I wasn't home. She came to the church and found me lying on the tomb floor, unable to get up. I've thought about who would be in a graveyard in the middle of the night, but what I can't fathom out is why they would jump out at me and shout, 3. Well, I thought about it for a few seconds, but my response was a shrug and a single answer of, "Kids." We exchanged pleasantries for a few more minutes before I escaped the situation. "So, Father Simon, I seek forgiveness not for breaking the Reverend's ankle, though obviously I am ashamed that he had to spend almost 4 hours in a cold, damp tomb, but for my taking my opportunity of not admitting to knowing why someone would shout 3 at him. I obviously was so focused on my run past that I was counting out loud, and my 3 was the kickstart, coming after 1 and 2, to look at what the vampire was doing. I've never told anyone this story before, not even my wife and kids, who were christened in the church as I moved back to the village a couple of years later." Well, there's an unusual. It's certainly an unusual story, which does span 20 years. Mark, he was being a chivalrous kind of guy, I think. But anyway, then saw what he thought was a vampire. Turned out to be the vicar. The vicar falls down the tomb and breaks his ankle and lies there for a few hours before he's rescued by his wife. Could happen to anyone. What do you say, Joe?
Well, I just say this is all very, very unfortunate, and one of the best stories I've heard, just so fantastic. I don't think there's anything to forgive, really, because if you did meet the vicar all those years later, you just wouldn't, would you? You just wouldn't say, well, actually, I was that person.
It was me and I was counting.
You just wouldn't. I'd like to award you with an Oscar for your acting, because that was
Thank you.
Very, very impressive, and you maintained it throughout the entire story, so well done to you. But yeah, nothing to forgive, just very, very funny. But the vicar will now know, obviously, through the power of radio too.
I should apologise really to all vicars, because I did sort of continue the myth that they all speak like the vicar in Dad's Army. Anyway, what do you say, Bobby?
Yeah, fabulous story. I mean, serendipity all round. First of all, we'll come back to the hiding in the bushes bit later, but what vicar dresses as a vampire and then does genealogy in the middle of the night because they've got insomnia? I really don't believe the vicar. I think Mark's absolutely fine. I think it's a real story, but I think you should not be too near the vicar too often. I really do worry. That is quite a story.
It was creepy behaviour, wasn't it?
He kept his teeth in and everything, which are really uncomfortable, and went to the churchyard in the middle of the night dressed as a vampire.
Looking around the graves.
What vicar does that?
Maybe he's a vampire vicar.
Well, that's a worry. But you don't have to be forgiven, except for hiding in the bushes to let a lady go by because it might be more scary to be out in the street. No, Mark, not forgiven for that.
Right. So it's the people's verdict. Please do you forgive Mark, yes or no, for his vampire and vicar story on the text 88291.
The Confessions Podcast.
That was Mark's fantastic, decade-spanning, vicar-startling story, Boom Shake the Tomb, which prompted memories about other men of the cloth's off-duty hobbies from one particular listener.
We have Mary Fraser just giving us a bit of an insight here of having lived next door to a vicarage during the formative years of the ages 5 to 18. I can testify with confidence to the range of odd behaviours of your average vicar. One made home wine and served up at the parish prayer meetings, getting everybody tipsy. Another bred dogs. Another was an avid reader of the Racing Post.
They're very good.
By surprise, those.
And whenever the clergy turn up on these confessions, they're always good fun. So
Yes.
we'll take some more. If you're clergy, get in touch.
Still to come on this week's podcast, the farce is strong in this wannabe Jedi's confession.
We turned and we saw the parish priest sat in his chair, fully robed. We then saw past the priest to the small congregation sitting in the first couple of pews, and then we saw the coffin.
Oh.
I'm going to try this line and see if I get away with it. You'd be mad to miss that one. No.
Do it again.
Okay. No, I'm just not going to do it again.
No.
I'm just going to plough on. So let's take our weekly trip over to the parish notice board and find out what's been making your metaphorical curtains twitch. Bobby, what have you got?
Here's the evidence that our confessions provide an educational purpose as well as an entertainment one through this missive from Miss Emma Drew Smith. She says, "Hello, Simon, Joe and Bobby. I'm Emma. I am 11 years old and I listen to your podcast on the way to and from swimming every week. I have been listening to your podcast for about 2 years. I like listening to your podcast because they make me laugh, especially when Simon does his funny voices." Don't we all?
Not intentionally funny, are they?
No, I just think they're serious voices.
Okay, I also enjoy the non-compliant confessions because they make me ask my dad, what do they mean? What does that mean?
Yes.
What are they talking about?
Yes, I'm aware that sometimes they might cause particular issues. Maybe there should be a PG or something like that. Maybe it should be a 15 certificate. Anyway, maybe some things are best left to the imagination.
And from the virtual parish notice board, I have some submissions from Twitter to share with you. So we have Chantel McGregor, who says, "I love the confessions on Radio 2. I didn't know they complied them."
Oh, really? Oh, thanks.
No. Matt Fido was thrilled that Lincoln was featured last week, adding, "Of course it would have something to do with that infamous railway barriers. This refers to George's Don't Go Breaking My Horn confession, in which his faulty brake pedal ended up riling a group of bikers at a level crossing. That was when he pressed the brake, the horn went off."
And his horn went off, yes. That's
Yeah.
a bit of a shocker.
Yeah. And Emma West just tweeted because she wants to be forgiven for the funny looks that she received walking through Copenhagen Airport while listening to last week's podcast.
Forgiveness all round, Emma. So each confession receives, as you know by now, a rigorous health and safety check from our top production team before it gets anywhere near the radio. But obviously the BBC cannot be held responsible for any odd glances bestowed upon subscribers whilst listening.
And on the subject of editorial checks and balances, here's a taster of some of the confessions that didn't make the shortlist for this week's podcast. So listen on with care to our X-rated section.
Ralph sets the bar pretty low this week with his tale of potentially poisonous mushrooms, a dinner served to Ralph's boss, a late-night trip to the hospital, stomach pumps, and a dead family pet. Anyway,
no.
That's about as much as we can say, but at least I can understand why that's got an X certificate.
Andrea's story involves less death and sickness, but does recall the time a mad dash to the loo from her car was halted by the sudden reappearance of an old family friend and his wife and children, who wanted to stay and chat. The tale does not end well for Andrea's clothes, her garden path, or that particular friendship.
Yes, that's a good one. I can understand why we didn't do that. And Simon's confession about taking a drunk friend and his camp bed outside the hut that they were staying in the middle of the night sounds harmless enough until we tell you that they woke up the next day to 3 inches of snow and frankly were lucky to be alive. And they were very confused and they had a big hangover. So no further comment to be passed. Suffice to say that we would like your contributions, whatever the topic. Keep them coming. confessions@bbc.co.uk, along with general comments and chit-chat surrounding what we do and praising us to the skies because we like that.
If you possibly could,
Yes.
That brings our parish notice board section to a close for this week. So let's head back to the confessions that did make the cut this week. Here's Martin's multiplex massacre mishap really slaying something.
The Confessions Podcast.
Father Simon and the Friendly Females of Forgiveness is how he begins this. My story dates back to 2003 when I worked as a cinema projectionist. In those days there was no digital projection, so all the movies were on 35mm celluloid film. This meant that each film had to be assembled by hand in the correct reel order and then previewed by the projectionist who'd put the film together to check for print damage. A spare length of film would be added to the end of the last reel with a length of masking tape attached to it, onto which information relating to that specific film would be added. Things like the movie's title, the certificate, the running time, sound format, aspect ratio, all that kind of stuff. This piece of spare film was called a tail tag, and this was to help make sure the projectionists showed the correct film to the public. I worked in a large 14-screen cinema, 8 screens on one level and 6 screens on another. This meant that a minimum of 2 projectionists were on duty at any one time, with a projectionist taking a level each. These days, there are no projectionists because it's all done automatically, so this is a vintage confession. In total, there were 6 projectionists, and we all got on and worked well in our small team. Everyone was hard-working, professional, and up to the task of dealing with the various stresses that running a 14-screen cinema can bring. But as with all workplaces, there is always somebody who manages to mess it up for everybody else without trying, and I'm afraid to say it was no different working at the cinema. One of our fellow projectionists, let's call him Malcolm, didn't take his responsibilities seriously at all. He would often come to work with a raging hangover because he would go out the night before partying and drinking to all hours, seemingly unaware that he would have an early shift the next morning. This resulted in the wrong films being put on, films usually out of focus and starting late. The result of Malcolm's irresponsibility to take his duties seriously often resulted in other projectionists with whom he was on duty doing double the amount of work, effectively running an entire 14-screen cinema on their own. We all know people like Malcolm. Every
Quite
workplace
bitter, isn't he?
has a Malcolm. I don't think he's over it, is Martin. The checking process was simple. As soon as the Carlton advertising logo appeared, we would use that to check for focus and sound level before the trailers began. And because Malcolm was often enjoying a cigarette break at this time, we other duty projectionists often had to cover these issues for him. One Sunday, Malcolm was the first projectionist on duty to operate the early morning run, and I would show up later that morning to assist during busier times. In typical fashion, when I arrived, things were already stressful. I heard from the cinema manager that there'd already been late start for the films and that Malcolm kept disappearing. As the day progressed, everything started to smooth out, and thankfully, Malcolm was coming to the end of his shift. He started his final film of the day and then went home. All was quiet until about 10 minutes after Malcolm had started his last film. I got a call over the walkie-talkie from the manager asking me to go down to the lower level as there was a problem. When I arrived, I could see my manager surrounded by furious parents and children crying
I can't
very
wait.
hard. What had happened? In typical Malcolm fashion, the wrong film was playing, and it definitely wasn't one for all the family. How had this happened? The harassed manager sternly asked. I passed the buck to the recently departed Malcolm, who was responsible for the screens on this level. Well, not entirely. You see, like a section of well-worn celluloid, I had reached breaking point and decided to edit Malcolm out of my working life. During one of Malcolm's endless cigarette breaks, I snuck down to his level, in every sense of the word, and swapped the tail tags of 2 movies. I left before Malcolm returned to lace up his last film before the end of his shift. So instead of the parents and their children sitting down to watch Finding Nemo, Certificate U, what they actually got was Freddy vs. Jason, Certificate 18. Contains scenes of gore, horror, machetes and dismemberment.
No!
I have no idea what repercussions Malcolm faced when he arrived at work the next day. I had handed in my notice 2 weeks earlier, and this was my last shift. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't go home that evening with a very large smile on my face. I don't regret dropping Malcolm in it. He was a plonker. Nor do I seek forgiveness from the put-upon manager left to deal with the fallout of a screen full of apoplectic parents and traumatised tots. Nor even those parents and children who, instead of some CGI fish, got an unwelcome few minutes of gore, violence and machetes. I certainly don't seek it from the cinema chain I work for. Back then, I was only making £4 an hour, and as any projectionist will tell you, that wasn't anywhere near enough money for the amount of responsibility that we had. As champions of the importance of corrected cinema projection, I feel that in some way I've let these people down as well as the profession itself. Anyway, Martin in London needs some forgiveness here. I mean, I can see that that's a funny prank. However, if I was the parent of a 6-year-old lining up for Finding Nemo, although I remember going to see Finding Nemo and having to walk out because it was too loud for child 3 and too disturbing, I can imagine Freddy versus Jason would have been a horrific moment for parents everywhere.
My moral compass has just exploded. I was going along so far. I was like, yeah, this is funny. Oh, this is funny. This is funny. This is wrong. You're seeking forgiveness. You're not getting it from me. The fact it was so premeditated, so he was stitching up Malcolm, but then also those kids. Just think of the children. If my daughter or any of my kids had been in there and then they'd seen some kind of horror slasher movie, I would be apoplectic.
I went on the BBFC. Oh, stupid.
Where did you go?
The BBFC
Did
app
you get lost?
is fantastic because it tells you all the kind of nasty bits of any movie. If you know, as a parent, it's a really good thing to look at. If you want to say, you know, are my kids okay with this? So I looked up Freddy versus Jason. It's extraordinary. I mean, the stuff that you wouldn't want your kids to see, you name it, it was in it. Bobby Pryor.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is obvious. This is wrong. It's wrong on so many levels. I understand all your pressures, Martin, and it seems to be that you were taking them all on at once. Finding Nemo is a little bit scary. The thing is, I don't agree with you setting up because he would have done it himself in the end, and what you should have done is just gone to the managers and said, you need to sort this. That's what you should have done. Also, if you did do that, you should have done it the other way round and played Finding Nemo to the adults, because that's a different kind of complaint. It's the same thing without the damage.
Is that right?
I'm not saying that's what you should have done, but I'm saying if you did it that way, we'd have kind of made it, maybe have forgiven you a little bit and understood your situation. So you're not forgiven on every level.
He's not even sorry.
No,
just
he's
from
not.
what you're saying, he's not sorry at all. So
just
how could he
wants to-
possibly expect to be forgiven?
He just wants to say he played Freddy versus Jason to a bunch of kids and apoplectic parents.
Get out of here.
All right, get out of here. Anyway, it maybe the people's verdict will echo what Bobby and Joe say. It might be something different. 88291.
The Confessions Podcast.
Okay, gather round. Here we go. We have another confession. So here's tonight, and it is another clerical one, actually. This one, well, it's signed Anakin. Okay? Gives you a little flavour of what's to come. Dear Monsignor Mayo and the Forgiving Flock, the year is 1977. I was 6. My favourite film of all time, Star Wars, A New Hope, had just been released. My dad had taken me and my sister to see the film, and it was awe-inspiring. I became totally immersed in all things Star Wars, even having my shirt signed by David Prowse when he visited Paignton, much to my mum's annoyance. I digress. Just as important to this confession is the detail that for my whole childhood, I had the full Roman Catholic education. Nuns in primary school, monks in secondary school, but it's the primary school years which are the focus for this disclosure. As was pretty much mandatory, I was an altar boy at the church, attached to the primary school. Once a year, the bishop would visit, which would mean only one thing, and that is High Mass. This is the full-blown 90-minute episode with every altar boy in attendance, incense, holy water, the cross, and lots of acolytes. Acolytes, for those not of a church-going persuasion, are candles about 3 feet long, held in a brass candlestick holder, which is about 1 foot long. It's a big beast. The bishop's forthcoming visit was a mixed blessing. Apart from having to endure 90 minutes of High Mass, I got paid £1 for attending by the bishop's assistant, but also, more importantly, I got time off schoolwork to rehearse for the service. And rather than having to wear the usual cassock and cotter, think of a full-length black dress from neck to shoes with a white shirt over the top, we wore a special light beige full-length cassock with ceremonial hood and rope belt.
Oh,
How
wow.
impressive is that? A lot of people may well be ahead of me at this point. These only came out once a year when the bishop visited, but did we look good in our special light beige full-length cassocks with ceremonial hoods and rope belts? I think we did. With just over a week to go, the nuns released me and my friend Richard from the lesson to attend practice with the priest. But on entering the vestibule, the small room next to the altar, the priest was nowhere to be seen. As Richard changed into the beige cassock for the dress rehearsal, I couldn't help but notice how similar he looked to Sir Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan Kenobi, especially when he had his hood up. Not to be outdone, I adorned the full-length black cassock and became Darth Vader. Grabbing 2 acolytes, we were which, as you remember, a 3-foot candle and a 1-foot candle holder, we were soon having a make-believe Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi lightsaber battle as seen in A New Hope. With every swish of the candle, we would recite the words, "You can never defeat me, Darth," to which I would reply, breathing heavily in a Darth Vader master tone, "I am the master, old man," and so on. Every swish of the candle would be accompanied with a zwoosh sound that the lightsaber made. We climbed the 3 stairs to the altar, and I was then about to deliver the killer death blow to Obi-Wan when we heard a quiet but forceful ahem. We stopped dead in our tracks. It's the priest from yesterday.
Yes, the vampire vicar.
We turned and we saw the parish priest sat in his chair, fully robed, We then saw past the priest to the small congregation sitting in the first couple of pews, and then we saw the coffin.
Oh.
Whilst we were reliving the Death Star's lightsaber battle scene, friends and relatives were paying their last respects to a recently dearly departed. Oh, no. There was now only one thing to do. Place the candles either side of the coffin, genuflect, turn 180 degrees, and get out of there quicker than you can say, Red 5 going in. And so this brings me on to begging for forgiveness, not from the parish priest. He never mentioned it and probably thought it was just two young altar boys placing 4-foot candles either side of the departed. I don't think he did, actually. I also don't seek forgiveness from the family. Hopefully they were none the wiser and the additional candles made for more fitting tribute. However, I do ask for forgiveness from the recently deceased who was expecting a full Catholic funeral but ended up getting a Jedi one, with Darth and Obi-Wan having a vocal candle battle. I said you were better, Joe. Now
Sorry.
You sound poorly again. Anyway, with the brief appearance of a priest halfway through, I wish the priest had some more words in there. Anyway, it's Anakin sending in tonight's priestly confession about how their attempt to recreate the final duel from Star Wars ended up as being the centerpiece of someone's funeral. Let's check in here with young Joe.
Well, I think it was kind of too good of an opportunity to miss, wasn't it, really? With all those props and stuff to
If you've
just
got that
play
gear
a
on.
thing in flipping Star Wars. How amazing is that? To do the lightsaber battle. Unfortunate there was a funeral going on. Very unfortunate. But how were they to know? And they did genuflect at the right point, so we'll forgive them.
Okay. It's gone well so far. Let's check in with Bobby. Moral compass.
Well, I wrote down the same. I wrote down props, costumes, imagination. How could you not? And also, I think any family of the dearly departed, if they had even caught a glimpse of that, they would have, they would have had a little smile to themselves, because that's what you want, isn't it? And you want a kind of, I don't know, a nice future kind of thing to think about in sad times. And I think most people have got a sense of humour in that situation.
It's quite good to have a laugh, but maybe not just at that.
But it was innocent. What I'm saying is,
moment.
it was innocent, and I'm sure it would have heartened them, not disappointed them. You're forgiven.
The Confessions Podcast.
That confession was from Anakin, possibly not his real name, and his tale from the dark side, saving the best to mass. One responder on the People's Verdict suggested that a whole new church service industry could be developed on the back of this.
Craig from Swansea, absolutely forgiven, just wondering if they would be available for a reenactment for my funeral when that day comes.
Well, that's an interesting idea, if you could have Jedi warriors performing at your funeral.
Something to bear in mind, isn't it? I'd go for, what would you do? Maybe Moulin Rouge kind of funeral. I'd quite like one of those.
Do you think?
Yeah. Am I thinking a bit too deeply about this now?
I haven't really planned. Have you planned your funeral, Bobby?
Yeah, I have,
you?
yeah.
What kind of thing would you like?
Well, no, it's personal, but when you've planned a few, you realise actually that there's no real rules. You think there should be rules. Obviously, there's tradition and convention, but outside that, the rules are actually quite limited. It's worth checking, because you can do such nice things.
I think I'd like to have Smiley Miley at mine and make it like into a Radio 1 roadshow. The fun starts at 10, but the service is at 11. Yes, and hold it in Weston-super-Mare.
And if Smiley Miley's not available, I'll be there as well. I can be Smiley Wiley instead.
Oh, yes.
That is...
Gold.
Yeah, that's an idea for a feature. It's a little late, but it's an idea for a feature. Anyway, it's just time to close the curtains on this week's batch of confessions. If you want to send in your own, it's confessions@bbc.co.uk. If you think we're finished, you're sorely mistaken, because now it's time for our weekly trawls through the archives to dig out a confession from the crypt.
And today's confession request comes from Deborah Croney, who says, Dear Simon and Joe, I have a number of friends who have very stressful and vital roles in public service. I've introduced them all to your show and podcast. I know it lightens their load and makes stressful days bearable. Together we recall the confessions and we have a good giggle. You perform a real public service.
Oh, good.
I write to thank you and your team for such a wonderful show and to request the confession that got me hooked on your show. It was, in fact, the first confession I ever heard. It involved the construction of a building extension and a dead badger.
Aye.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
With warm wishes, Deborah Croney.
Deborah, unlike some building firms, we are able to deliver on time and on budget. Here is the story that we called Woe Diggity.
The Confessions Podcast.
Forgive me, Father Simon, Sister Bobby, and Reverend Sportsman in the cheap seats.
Hey, that's me.
That is you. Back in 1991, I had recently passed my driving test. And once the urge of freedom had been taken, I discovered an interesting thing. And this interesting thing is women from beyond the village. Who knew? Well. After an agreeable meeting with a lady who would go on to become my first wife, there's so much history in that.
My first wife?
There's so much history in that half a sentence.
Yes.
After an agreeable meeting with a lady who would go on to become my first wife, I was returning early one summer morning to my lodgings, feeling very happy with myself. The driveway to the place where I was working and staying at the time, which is a local health spa, was 1.5 miles long. And as I approached the place, it was in darkness apart from my headlights. It's possible I may have been thinking of other things as I drove up, which meant that I almost didn't see what was in the road ahead of me, but I managed to slam on the brakes just in time. I discovered someone driving away from the spa hours earlier had knocked over a badger, which lay very still in the road ahead of me. Being an animal lover, I got out to see if there was anything I could do, but a quick check confirmed it was too late to help him out. Not wanting to leave the creature in the middle of the road for someone else to hit, I decided to do the decent thing and bury the badger. Luckily, the health spa was being renovated at the time, meaning the plan I'd quickly formed could be executed without... What are you laughing at?
Oh, I'm well ahead here. Go on. Luckily.
Health spa was being renovated at the time, meaning the plan I'd quickly formed could be executed without alerting anyone else. Using my staff keys to unlock it, I found a shovel and a torch in one of the maintenance buildings. I then carried the late badger to the back of the grounds and, blessed as the spa was with 50 acres of lush rolling land and a lot of grass, I started to dig a grave far away from the main building. After what seemed like hours, the grave was almost deep enough. With my last shovel of earth, I heard a dinging sound, which at the time I put down to a stone or pebble, but I didn't think about it too much. I knew I lowered the poor badger into its final resting place, replacing the loose soil back to the grave. Once I was done, I said a few words. I bet he didn't. What words do you say over a badger?
Bless this badger.
Bless this badger.
Yeah.
Thank you for this badger and everything that the badger has done. Fast forward to 6 hot weeks later, and the health spa had been renovated, with business almost returning to normal. But then one morning I was fast asleep on a day off when I was rudely awakened by sirens. Sirens? Lots of them. I stuck my head out of the bedroom window to see a car park full of ambulances, a police car, and I was very intrigued. Being curious, I took a stroll over to the main entrance to see people being led out on stretchers, some walking out with blotches and rashes under the cover of blankets.
Wow.
No one seemed to know what had caused this sudden outbreak of illness, and so the health spa was put into a lockdown whilst investigations were carried out. It was a week or so later when all the staff were told to gather in the sports hall for an update. The boss of the health spa then told us that the water in the building had been severely contaminated, and that the maintenance staff and the Environment Agency had discovered what they thought were the remains of a badger. According to the experts, this badger had tried to make a set in the spa grounds, and whilst tunnelling with its sharp claws, it had somehow managed to rupture a pipe. Killed instantly by the pipe explosion, they said, the decomposing badger remains had seeped into the water system, which eventually affected the drinking water and the swimming pool, among other areas within the building. As you can imagine, Father Simon, by now my stomach was churning like a washing machine, but I managed to keep my silence and nod along with the findings of those in charge. Dear, that's terrible. How did that happen? Luckily, all the illnesses were minor and short-lived for those affected. I could see Bobby taking note of that. But I was soon to find out that there was a financial cost, if not a human one, to my rash actions. Listening to all the staff gossip, I discovered the replacement of pipes and cleansing of water and general repairs had cost the health spa a 7-figure sum.
Goodness me.
Which it's fair to say was more than I was earning back then or ever.
Well, yeah, I'd have thought so.
I have lived with this dark secret until now, but I do plead for forgiveness from the three of you, as I was only trying to do the right thing by the badger. Well, that makes it one of the most expensive confessions I think that we probably had, you know. So 7 figures, that's a lot of money. But he was trying to do the right thing by the badger, even said a few emotional words.
Do you want a bit of history?
I don't know.
You know the Brontes?
really.
You know the Brontes in Haworth?
I've heard of them.
Yeah, in their village, because of the way they buried people, the high death rate in the village was attributed to the way they buried people, and they had to change it.
Is that right?
Yeah, so there you go.
What a mine of information you are.
There you go. So you want to look it up.
So you have to be very careful about burying badgers.
Well, it wasn't badgers, it was people. So there you go.
Same
Bit
rules.
darker. Anyway, what I was going to say was, the thing is, it's stupid, is you try to do a good thing. The only thing is about burying, I don't have this thing about burying animals, is if their relatives go looking for them, they don't know where the body is. They think they've run off with someone else. So you know.
Do you think they think like that?
Well, I think they could do. So
Where's Barry gone? Oh, he'll have gone off.
Barry,
Gone for that other badger,
you
won't he?
could see the way he was looking at Mary the badger from.
because there's no evidence. So that's my only thought. But you know what? The thing is all your intentions were good. You want to know, and I would have.
There was
staged
Gertie the
them as
badger
well.
from down the way. Dirty Gertie from number
Listen,
30.
Stewpot, you're forgiven. It wasn't your fault. You didn't intend to. Unforeseen circumstances.
Yeah, a lot of immorality going on here, I think. What do you think, Brother
Well,
Matthew?
7 figures to fix a pipe. Need a new plumber there, mate. 7 figures?
All the other
I mean,
pipes.
Come on.
They went into the swimming pool.
Yeah, well, you just fix the pipe. Fix the 7 figures, that'll be... What? How far down did he dig this hole to bury this badger that you're rupturing pipes? This is one of those times where I'm very thankful that I'm, by nature, a very lazy person, because I certainly wouldn't have been digging any holes.
What would you have done then?
Probably...
Just put it to the side of the road.
Yes,
Fair enough.
yes, I'd like to think I'd have done that, or maybe I'd have just, done
Swerved.
nothing. Yeah, but of course I wouldn't have done that. I would have
Done the right
contacted
thing.
the authorities. The badger authorities. So I am going to forgive, but not the plumber who's charging 7 figures to mend a pipe.
The Confessions Podcast.
That was your confession from the crypt this week, featuring Brother Matt and Sister Bobby. And that did sound expensive.
It was a very expensive mistake, but it was a lovely story in the end. Sad beginning, but lovely in the end.
I guess, kind of. It's quite extreme, wasn't it?
Yeah, so normally, if there's a dead animal, obviously those confessions don't get on, because it's not really the done thing. But at least in this case, everyone was trying to do the right thing.
They were.
Yes, they were.
Which is a nice thought.
If you have a request, by the way, for a vintage confession, send us as many details about it as you can, including when we first read it out. That always helps. Send it to confessions@bbc.co.uk and we'll do our best to unearth them, which is kind of apt considering the past confession. It's also the same address, the same email address for our own original confessions.
All right, almost time to say goodbye for another week. Regular listeners will know that each time we're here, we ask you to tweet us a special code phrase to prove you've listened right to the bitter end. This is the bitter end. Thanks to everyone who tweeted last week's phrase, fat, gristle and rind.
Yeah, thankfully that's the last time I'll have to hear you say that.
Much to Joe's discomfort. Including Swanee and Neris and Adi, Charlie and Callum Rowe. And this week's new code phrase is chosen here by Joe.
Lots and lots of acolytes, spell ACOLYTES, and no gristle in sight.
Okay, thank you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Confessions podcast and that we're live Monday to Friday at 5 p.m. Thank you for downloading this wonderful podcast from the BBC.
The Confessions Podcast. Go in peace.